Jeff, it's a pleasure to be here interviewing you today. And my first question is a big question. You obviously have a passion for the old regime. And so I wonder if you could tell us why you find the old regime so fascinating.
First, thank you, Victoria, for asking me these questions. The short answer to that is that by the time I graduated from high school, I knew that 18th century France would be my home away from home. Against the background of the 1960s, I was very taken with the ideals of the Enlightenment and the revolution that liberated France from what I then thought of as the shackles of the Ancien Regime. As I went on into college and graduate school, I realized, of course, that those high school ideas I had were really caricatures, and that the exponents of change were not nearly as noble and the opponents of change were not nearly as simple as I had imagined. So I found myself increasingly interested in the Ancien Regime itself more than the Enlightenment and the Revolution, and especially the tensions between its principles and practices, and especially in the ways in which change can unfold within structures and values that seem to prohibit change but actually enable challenges to tradition. And that's a theme that runs through much of my work.
That's really interesting, thinking about how change evolves within structures. Is that one of the links that connects your early writing on Jansenism and the Crown with your later, more recent writing on the familial and political order of France? Are there other links as well?
Yes, that's certainly the major link between my older work and my newer work, both of which could be situated under the umbrella of absolutism, specifically its religious aspects and its familial aspects. In both regards, I've been particularly interested in the ways in which discussions about the use and abuse of authority took place within traditional principles and enabled conflicts that in turn undermined those very traditions. So on the religious front, we find the notion that the king reigned by divine right, ruled in the name of God in the interest of the national faith. The king was expected in religious terms to rule in certain ways. But if you study the disputes over Jansenism and Protestantism that span the 18th century, you find a good deal of disagreement about what ruling in the name of God and ruling in the interest of religion meant. So that we find bishops, we find magistrates in the parliaments, royal ministers advancing different interpretations, conflicting interpretations of the religious traditions of the monarchy. And the same carries over on the familial side. The king is supposed to rule like a father, justly, rationally, to rule subjects treated like children, who theoretically at least are incapable of ruling themselves. But if you look at the way in which that rhetoric is used against the background of the ongoing disputes about taxation and royal administrative practices, royal challenges to the privileges of individuals and corporate bodies and provinces in the course of the century, again, there are disputes about what reigning in a fatherly way means. So whether you're looking at the religious complex in my earlier work or in the familial issues in the later work, the question really is, how should a religiously ordained and fatherly ruler rule, and who has the right to object when he doesn't seem to be ruling in that way? And various bodies and people claim that, that right to speak against the royal abuse of authority in the name of the monarchy itself as the century unfolds. And on the familial side, I really became more interested in what's going on at the familial level as opposed to the royal rhetorical level. And the way things work there is that fathers are supposed to rule their households like miniature monarchs, if you will. Their authority comes from God. They're supposed to use it in a rational and just manner to ensure order in their families in the same way that the king ensures order in the kingdom. But what happens if the father, like the king, doesn't rule in that way? What if he yields to his passions? What if he exercises his authority in a despotic way? What if he's too weak and doesn't know how to rule properly and anarchical situations arise? And that's the context in which wives file complaints against their husbands for abuse of authority, for verbal abuse and for physical abuse.
It's so interesting. I think that you've really revised our thinking about absolutism, showing both how the model permeates throughout society, and also how it's less absolute in the sense that there's room for contestation at all levels. And as you mentioned, it was getting into the archives and seeing how it really worked that allowed you to understand how complex it was. And I think you're rather famous for working your way methodically through one particular series in the archives, the Y series, the Records of the Châtelet. What made you decide to focus on that series and to work through it the way in which you have?
Well, one of the shortcomings of my first project, the book ended up being called The Desacralization of the French Monarchy in the 18th Century, it doesn't really have any roots in the streets. It's about ideology, it's about rhetoric, it's about the ways in which the traditions of absolutism could be recycled, deployed, reversed in order to support criticism of absolutism. So as I moved into the more familial type of research, I was determined this time to make sure that I had some roots in the streets for the work. I wanted to find out what this meant at the level of the experience of ordinary people. Well, the best way to find out what's going on in the lives and, to the extent we can, the minds of ordinary people, at least in Paris in the course of the 18th century, is to go to the Y series, where you find the records of the district police commissioners. They are voluminous. You can easily get lost in this series. The way to make it manageable, since there's no indexing of any sort, is to do soundings. So I picked 1725, 1750, 1770, 1775, and worked my way through the papers of all of the commissioners for each of those years, looking for complaints of wives against their husbands, some of which progressed to actual marital separation suits, and also looking for suicide cases and sodomy cases. Suicide and sodomy were both offenses under religiously informed criminal law, and that also started out under the umbrella of absolutism because the king was supposed to enforce religious standards of behavior. And suicide and sodomy were no-nos in that regard. So I worked my way through the soundings of commissioners' papers looking for what I call my 3 S's, the separations, the sodomy cases, and the suicide cases. It took a long time. These papers, for one commissioner for 1 year, you might get 500 manuscript pages. You might get as many as 5,000. And the only way to find what you're looking for is to read the subject tags, which are usually located in the upper right-hand corner. And each commissioner has more than one clerk, so there are questions about handwriting, the usual 18th century issues about abbreviations that are used, and how you follow them from one's clerk to another. In doing this archival work, I wanted to do 2 things. In the first place, I did not want to lose the specificity of individual cases. One of the historians who most impressed me in graduate school was Richard Cobb, and his wonderful way of resurrecting individual lives and individual voices and triumphs and tragedies. So I've tried to be very attentive to the specificity of my individual cases. At the same time, I've also tried to look for patterns, and to the extent that I feel comfortable doing so, make generalizations about the assumptions and attitudes of the ordinary people whose lives and deaths are recorded. in these remarkable commissioner's reports, and of course also to see if I can track any sorts of changes over time.
That combination of the individual lives and the patterns that show you change over time, as well as patterns at a certain time period. You do that so wonderfully in your work. It really, teaches us some big things about the 18th century, and also introduces us to some very interesting characters that you found in the archives. And I was wondering what your most exciting discovery has been. Is there one moment that really stands out in your memory as being just an epiphany or a very exciting moment?
Well, there have actually been quite a few of those because, as you know, when you go to the archives and order your cartons, you really never know what you're going to find from one day to the next. And sometimes it seems like plodding along, you're not finding any treasures. But then other days, the most remarkable things show up. I think the most extraordinary thing I ever stumbled into were the records of the most spectacular marital separation case of 1775 involving the Marquis and Marquise de Chambonnan. I found 100 folio pages of depositions from witnesses. Practically everyone in the household, all the servants, the neighbors and their servants, the in-laws and their servants. And I was able to reconstruct in considerable detail communications among the parties. I even found people agreeing to testify one way or another. And you can see the witnesses actually manipulating the available evidence in order to make either the husband or the wife look good or bad. I even found servants testifying about what went on between the supposedly closed doors of their bedrooms. So it was really an extraordinary case of the phenomenon that I'm really interested in all of this works, which is the multiple versions of the same thing, whether you're talking about separations or suicides or sodomy cases. The story gets told and retold, and I've never yet been able to piece together a story with as much detail as I could in this case because of the amazing documentary evidence that survived.
Such a gold mine. Your work, the direction that it took you looking into these family cases and then also looking at sodomy cases, really led you to be a pioneer in French history and the history of sexuality and in the history of homosexuality. Was that something that you just fell into because of where the archives were taking you? Was it something that you were interested in seeing, how much there was about the history of homosexuality and sexuality in general?
Well, that too has a long story, which I'll try to make short. Questions about suicide and sodomy and blasphemy and so forth showed up early on in my work under the religious police of the realm and the king's supposed obligation to enforce religious standards of behavior. So it was there on the desk for a while. But then at the age of 30, I finally figured out that I'm gay, and I became involved in the work of the Committee on Lesbian and Gay History within the American Historical Association, and lo and behold, I ended up serving 4 years as its coordinator. Up until that complex of events, I hadn't really had any particular interest in this subject. But after 30 and through CLGH, I found myself becoming quite interested. I read the secondary literature. At that time it was quite manageable in scope, whereas today it's enormous. I got to know and interact with lots of people in the field, and I thought to myself, well, gee, I could probably do some research on this subject in 18th century France. At that time there wasn't much. There was the pioneering work of Michel Rey, which was very important and influential, but there remained a lot of materials yet to be explored. So I did what I've done with suicide, which is to read the prescriptive literature, to read the ideological debates at the level of high culture, and also, to look for the voices of ordinary people. particularly in sources that had not been explored at that point.
So,
Oops.
sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
I keep forgetting to push the button.
Okay. That's so interesting. And, you started out by mentioning that you got into French history because you were interested in, it was the 60s, and you were interested in the Enlightenment and the Revolution, and then kind of focused on the old regime. And your movement into the history of sexuality was related to your own personal history, as well as your, a part of which was your involvement with the Committee of Lesbian and Gay History. Are there other ways in which you think your personal politics, your personal life has informed your work as a historian?
There are quite a few. Beyond a general sense that studying human experience is a good thing for all humans, which I suppose comes out of a basic faith in the Enlightenment, and beyond the assumption that studying different times and places and learning about different types of people is beneficial for all of us, because after all, we're all different in one way or another. And even beyond the specific academic and political commitments that I developed with regard to LGBT history, I think there's a political thread running through a lot of my work that has something to do with looking for and demonstrating the ways in which humans living inside structures and values that might seem inflexible, if not repressive, manage to exercise agency. So if we look back to the early work, we have members of the clergy and the magistrates of the parliaments exercising agency in using the ideology of absolutism against what they regarded as abuses of royal authority. But they had official positions in the hierarchy of things. In the work that I've done more recently, I've been looking for ways in which ordinary people who had no such positions in hierarchical structures exercised agencies. And that's what's made the complaints of wives against their husbands so interesting. Here are women who, it has often been thought, really have no agency at all. But in practice, the structures and values of the Ancien Regime allowed them agency, enable them to complain against husbands who abuse their authority over their wives. And if they have the means to do so, to pursue legal redress through separation of persons or property. And I'd say my suicide and sodomy people also exercise agency by making decisions about how to live their lives or choose their deaths in ways that the structures they live within theoretically deny, but yet they claim this agency for themselves.
Is that something that you focus on in your teaching as well, this emphasis on individual agency within larger structures? I think we need your microphone, Jeff.
Sorry.
It's okay.
I think there's been a good deal of resonance between my teaching and my research over the years, especially in the latter phase of my teaching over the last 10 or 15 years or so. I've always, in my courses, tried to give a good deal of attention to tradition and to continuity, as well as to change. That certainly fits with my work, emphasizing that change happens slowly and that change can come out of tradition, not simply in opposition to tradition. As I moved more into social history myself, I found myself putting more emphasis on the experience of ordinary people in the courses that I taught, and putting a great deal of emphasis on how we know what we think we know when we're talking about the past. In other words, as I worked on separations and suicides and sodomy, I found myself asking more and more questions about the sources that I was using. Here are the sources that enable us to know about X. Here we hear what look like the voices of ordinary people from the past. But these voices are filtered in various sorts of ways. There are rhetorical conventions that are used. They're recorded by clerks. It's not really the voices of the people themselves, what they spoke. So in my courses, I found myself emphasizing more and more the process through which we come to know history, not just history as a product that other people produce. So I always tried to engage my students in discussions about how it is we think we know X or Y or Z. And let's look at some primary sources to see if we agree that you can extrapolate from this material in this way. Or here are several historians with different points of view about the same subject. Let's look at some of the sources that they use. So in other words, putting more emphasis on the process, not just on the product that comes out of historical research, in an effort to make my students more actively involved in learning about the past. So maybe the best example I can give of that sort of approach came from the seminar I taught for many years, and which was my favorite course to teach, the Seminar on Historical Method for History Majors, in which I developed a whole series of exercises around what happened on July 14, 1789. So I had students read accounts, multiple and conflicting accounts that were written at the time, and then read Michelet and Taine against each other, read a number of accounts that were written around the time of the bicentennial, left, right, and middle, read newspaper articles about how the bicentennial was celebrated and the political agendas that were built into that. And believe me, by the end of the semester, they were very tired of July 14, 1789. But after that, I think they were more likely, whenever they listened to a historian lecture or read a history book, to say, wait a minute, how do we know that? And are there perhaps other ways of looking at it? As opposed to just accepting, the final version, the product that we present in our articles and books and lectures, as opposed to, how did you get to that?
That's such an important skill to teach students, and that's such a wonderful exercise. It strikes me as we're talking that the topics that you focused on are so serious, marital separation, marital conflict, suicide, cases of sodomy, and yet when you write, you have such a wonderful sense of humor. You have a wonderful sense of humor as a person, but humor is really a big part of your writing. What do you think humor brings to historical scholarship and to the teaching of history? Oops, we need your microphone again.
We all like to laugh, and we as writers and teachers of history, I think would be well to remember that when we sit down to write and when we go into our classrooms. I think humor provides both a wonderful window into the past, as we know from the case of the Great Cat Massacre, for example. There are plenty of tragedies in history, and perhaps we tend to focus on them, but there's also a lot of bizarre and funny stuff in history. And when we find those stories in the archives, I think we should incorporate them into our work, and they certainly go over well in the classroom. Even in this day and age, many of our students come to college with a traditional rote conception of what history is about. It's memorizing names and dates. It's boring. I can't relate to these people at all. Therefore, it's important to, I think, to bring the lives of ordinary people into the classroom and to make our students see that for all the differences, these people in the past were like us to the extent that they laughed as well as cried. They sought happiness. They made jokes with each other. And in the archival records about all three of my F subjects, there are moments of comedy as well as tragedy. I think the bottom line is that we should take our work as teachers and writers very seriously, but we should try not to take ourselves overly seriously. Levity helps in the classroom, and levity would certainly help in departmental meetings and university affairs. But it's taken me quite a while to come to feel entirely comfortable with that myself. I've never really thought of myself as being an amusing person. I tend to think of myself as being rather pedantic and boring, and maybe I've consciously struggled against that for a very long time. But you know, if I go back and read my early work, which actually I don't do, but if I were to do that, I think I would find it rather stodgy by comparison with the way I've let myself write over, say, the last 20 years. That is to, and that involves more license to tell stories and to play with words. I don't write quickly, I write rather slowly, and that is in part because I labor a great deal over how words sound and how they sound together. And I love being able to work wordplay into the stuff that I'm writing now as opposed to what I did in my former self.
That's so interesting. I had the pleasure and the honor of working with you when you, along with Tip Reagan, co-edited a collection in which I had a chapter. You've worked collaboratively with a lot of people. You've worked with Dan Dasson, I think most recently in the volume on the family and gender in the old regime, with Tip Reagan, with Michael Sebelius, with others whose names I know I'm forgetting right at this moment. A lot of people are afraid of working collaboratively. So what would you say to those who fear that?
Get over it and do it. I mean, maybe part of it comes with being older and maybe wiser as well. I don't know, but just it comes through experience. You know, you get older, you feel less uptight and more able to enjoy wordplay in your writing. You get older and feel more secure, and you realize how little you know and how exciting it would be to learn along with other people, which frankly is something I don't think we do very well in our profession. You know, we're trained as solo artists, and generally we do our own thing. We go to conferences and present our papers and listen to other people's papers, but collaboration is certainly the exception rather than the norm in the historical profession. I've been lucky enough to work with people who are much brighter than I am and have complementary ways of looking at the world. If we use Isaiah Berlin's terms, I'm definitely a hedgehog. I am the sort of person who will research a subject intensively. I will work my way through those commissioners' papers, sample after sample. So the sort of person who is fun for me to work with is the fox, the person who sees the larger picture and can help the hedgehog make sense of all the digging and the collection of discrete information, help put it in a larger context and make a larger picture out of it. And those are definitely the sorts of people I've been lucky enough to work with. This has been especially valuable when it comes to translation. Tip Reagan and I did a translated volume, and we're actually working on another one now. And we all know how challenging translation is. And the advantages of collaboration are really apparent here. I'm the sort of person who tends to translate more literally, not just in terms of the words, but sentence structure and so forth. I want to stay as close to the original as possible. And Tip has been wonderful to work with because his argument has always been that our objective is to provide a readable version for modern English readers. So we have gone back and forth a great deal over the years, and through the combination of our complementary approaches, I hope produced better translations than either one of us would have done separately.
You've also worked with others in just the incredible amount of service that you've done. Really admirable how much you've served your university and the profession. You've been the president of, I think, every scholarly society related to your work: French Historical Studies, Western Society for French History, 18th Century Studies. You've also served as Associate Dean of Humanities at your university. has service been something that you've seen as kind of separate from your intellectual interests, or has it been related to your intellectual interest in terms of changing how you think about history or about the humanities in general?
Well, I wouldn't say that my service and administrative work has been directly connected to my work on 18th century France, but it has certainly helped me think a lot about the context in which that work on 18th century France takes place, and the sorts of things that all of us who do history, and indeed do the humanities, might well think about. The humanities are under a great deal of pressure, if not outright assault, in this country at this time. So I think it behooves us all to think carefully and seriously about what it is we're trying to accomplish as scholars and teachers in the humanities. I firmly believe in the value of the current movement emphasizing definition of learning objectives and program assessment, because it requires us to do something we don't really have a good history of doing, and that is talking collectively to each other, with each other, in our departments and our institutions, about what it is we're trying to accomplish in higher education in the 21st century. I think we're used to thinking about our courses as our courses, but they're not just our courses. They're courses within programs of study, within general education, between majors, or at least within a BA program in our institutions. And presumably, the overall objectives of those programs of study are to produce better workers, better citizens, lifelong learners for the future of the society in which we live. So I think it makes sense for us to define specific learning objectives for our courses, for our majors, that serve those general ends, and developing ways of assessing whether or not our students are getting out of our courses and majors what it is we think they should be getting. In the best of all possible worlds, all of the readings, all of the lectures, all of the papers, all of the exams in our courses would serve those ends. Although our objectives may be perfectly obvious to us, I think in general they're not to our students unless we make them transparent, which traditionally we haven't done. Unless we make it clear to our students that what we want them to get out of our history courses at the college level is something other than what they were getting out of their often rote history courses in K-12, they'll assume that this is more of the same. So I think it's really important for us to complement what we're trying to accomplish in terms of making our students more familiar with different times and places in the course of human history, with a set of objectives that have to do with skills in which the humanities should take front and center. They should play the prime role within the university. These are analytical skills. These are communicative skills, which they're going to need in whatever line of work they end up doing. So I would like to see history departments from the survey courses on make a break with the sort of historical experience the students have come in with, and make it clear to them what we want to get out, what we want them to get out of our courses, the transferable skills as well as the subject knowledge, and carry that all the way through our capstone courses for majors. In other words, I'd like to see more emphasis on how to think in addition to what to know.
That's very interesting, and it makes me think that young scholars are just starting out as graduate students or as assistant professors who are entering into the field of history are not only, coming in at a moment where the historiography has changed from when I started or from when you started, but also when the institutions in which we work and in which we do research have changed tremendously as well. I wonder what advice you would give to young scholars who are just starting out. Sorry, Jeff, we need your microphone again.
Sorry.
No, it's fine.
Incorrigible. In the best of all possible worlds, these sorts of issues would be discussed in graduate programs, and I hope that will come to be the case. In any case, I would hope they would be discussed in departments as a part of acculturating new faculty. We all know that the three things we're all supposed to do are research, teaching, and service. And I hope the expectations in all three of those areas will be discussed and revised as we move forward in the 21st century. After all, it's a very different world and a very different institutional world from the ones in which you and I were trained as graduate students. There is perhaps an unfortunate tendency, especially in research institutions, to tell new faculty members that what they really need to do is publish as much as possible, and they can catch up with teaching later on in service. Really don't worry about that until after you get tenure. And I think that's unfortunate, because it suggests that what we're trying to do is to clone ourselves, whereas we should be encouraging new faculty to be change agents, to help transform our departmental and institutional cultures, not just to replicate them. So sure, research is important, and of course people have to demonstrate their research abilities in order to get tenure. But I would like to see us involve new faculty members from the beginning in teaching in the way that I've just been talking about a bit before. When we come out of graduate school, it's very easy to think that our job as teachers is to teach our students what we have learned, with an emphasis on the subject material. Again, instead of thinking about what's going on in our courses in terms of the larger objectives of our programs of study. So I'd like to see us tell new assistant professors that what's going on in the classroom is not to make sure that our students master information, but for us to promote transformation for them, to help them become, course by course, the graduates that we want to see at the end of the process, from the beginning, from those survey courses on. As for service, that's always regarded as the least important of the three. Many people do no service at all. That's unfortunate for them as for their institutions. There's plenty of service to be done in our departments, in our institutions, and in our professional organizations, and we would all benefit from doing that. So again, I would like to see assistant professors involved in service from the beginning, even if it's just a departmental committee. It's really important as part of the process of acculturation and career development to learn how things work at the place where you're working. And the best way to do that is through experience. At the departmental level, at the college level, at the university level, and then beyond, including the professional organizations, because all of these things are going to belong to them sooner rather than later. My career seems to have gone by in a blink. I can remember the first time I went to the Western Society and listened in awe to the great old men talking, and now suddenly I'm retired and I'm not sure how it all went by so fast. But I think part of, if we're going to do any or all of this, part of the responsibility lies for those of us who are older and are tenured in terms of mentoring. Help our younger colleagues develop in ways that will make them successful, to be sure, in getting tenure and so forth, but also more well-rounded in terms of academic experience. More satisfied. Let's let them explore. Let's let them evolve over change. And bottom line, let's allow them to help us change our institutions and make them better places in the future.
I love, Jeff, how you talked about young scholars being agents of change within the institutions in which we work, and we started out with talking about wives and sodomites and others being agents of change within the old regime. So I really see a strong link between your research and your view of the profession. And I also see so strongly your emphasis on humanity, the humanity of the subjects of the past and the humanity of those with whom we work today. So that's really wonderful seeing those connections. I always learn so much from you, and today has been no exception. And I'd like to give you the last word. If there's anything you would like to add about your work, about the profession, about the old regime, love to hear it. Oh, we need your microphone again. It's failure of technology.
As I mentioned in passing, I am retired now. I have been retired for almost 2 years. I spent my last 3 years in administration, which was enormously educational, but was also hellacious. And by the time I retired, I wasn't sure if I would go back to 18th century France at all, or would I do something totally different, or would I try to be an activist in terms of higher ed reform or whatever. Well, the way things have worked out, I have returned to 18th century France, and with great joy and enormous satisfaction, I spend usually several hours every day working on 18th century France. I love every minute of it. I am so glad that I have returned to this part of my work. I wasn't sure if I would work on the same sort of things or other things, and it's some of both. I have 2 book projects in progress, both about homosexuality in 18th century France. I have a couple more articles to do about suicide. I've also got some political culture work I want to do. I've been amazed in pursuing these projects how much material is now available online. The incredible number of 17th and 18th century texts have been digitized and are in fact word searchable. It's just absolutely extraordinary and wonderful for someone like me now who does not have access to a major research library. And I hope to get back to Paris now and then to do some archival research, but I have plenty to keep me busy for a good many years. And who knows, I've followed serendipity many times in the course of my research. I just finished an article about Florida in 18th century English, German, French, Italian, and Swiss encyclopedias. There's something that I never expected to do, but now that I'm living in Florida and enjoying the sunshine every day, and the opportunity came up, that was a great deal of fun to explore, and it was possible to do the whole thing through online resources, which was wonderful.
Well, that's so great. Well, I know I look forward to reading your work, as I'm sure many others do, and look forward to seeing you at conferences or in Paris and having a glass of wine and a good laugh together. So thank you so much, Jeff. It's been a pleasure, as always.
Thank you, Victoria, for the good questions, and thanks to David Smith for handling the technological end of all of this, which is Greek to me.